In this episode of the Different Podcast, I talk with Steve Chalke about what it means to be considerate. Strangely, it's a word that we don't hear or think about that often, but through our chat, we see that to consider is perhaps one of the most powerful ways to transform our way of behaving in the world. To consider the other, to pay attention to have our eyes on the needs of others. It really does seem that it is the simple things that are the source of the greatest revolution. That is to love others as ourselves. Steve Chalke, really good to see you again.
Absolutely. Oh, it's always good to see you, Jill. Honestly, it is. Do you know, I love these.
That's good. Yeah.
Well, it's lovely sitting here chatting to you about all of this very important thing, and it makes a fantastic break from
the normal routine
of chairing meetings on Teams, which I've done several times today already. And
relief.
When you're on Teams, it's ever so or Zoom, it's ever so easy to lose attention, isn't it? Just for a moment or two.
It certainly is.
Yeah. When you're chairing the meeting, you just can't afford to, because you've got to be listening to everything everyone says and play everybody else
chat
in and watch the time and make sure you don't overrun and keep looking at the agenda and making sure that you're watching people's eyes. Do they want to speak and all that kind of stuff? And there you go. So this
so much easier when people are in the room.
It's like perfect.
Oh, well, that's good. That's good. This is perfect.
And we're going to talk about being considerate.
We are, which is another one of our 9 habits in Oasis, isn't it? So I thought it would be good for us to talk about this one. So where we're located now doing this recording, there's a tunnel, isn't there, up the road called Leek Street, graffiti tunnel.
Yes.
And I quite often take a little walk up there just to see what the street artists are doing.
The smell of paint.
The smell of paint and various other things in the tunnel. And there's often graffiti up there that is all about being kind in the world, which is really interesting that that's a space where people want to make a statement about kindness and being generous to people. And, and there's that phrase, isn't there? In a world where you can be anything, be kind, so this is something that people want. And yet something that has really bothered me for a whole bunch of time is the fascination we have with unkindness.
And yes.
Help me out, Steve.
Yeah, well, it's true, isn't it? So as you were talking, I'm thinking, so every morning I wake up and the alarm goes off at 6 o'clock. Often I'm awake before 6 o'clock, and sometimes I have to get up before 6 o'clock to whatever it is. But I'll be working before 6. But the alarm goes off, and we've got this system where the alarm goes off wherever you are in the house, just in case you got up and fallen asleep again. And the 6 o'clock BBC Radio 4 news comes on, and then you're straight into the headlines of the Today programme, which are like taking a daily dose of depression tablets to induce depression. So things that are happening around the world or in this country, but every single one of them is a miserable story. And Cornelia often says to me, why'd you have that? Because I make her listen as well. only because we share the same house, so she can't be listening to something different to me. It's like,
blaring out through the whole house.
She sometimes puts her headphones on.
Don't blame her.
And listens to radio too, which is a joyous thing. Loads of great music.
But it's a weird thing, isn't it? Like what we get told all the time is about being inconsiderate or being unkind.
Well, and there's a deeper question, absolutely. So who decided that those things were the news? Yeah. Who decided? Because it's like the TV news. It's always on for half an hour.
Why?
So, how come the
there's
world
half
news?
An hour of news.
There's always half an hour's worth, and then there's the weather.
And the weather always takes 2.1 minutes.
Yeah. So who decides these things are actually the news? And of course, there's been lots written about all of this. Yeah. And I can't even remember the names of some of the books that I've read about this, but we live in an age when different things are the news than used to be the news 100 years ago. Because 100 years ago, news used to travel at 20 miles an hour. So all news had to come to you at 20 miles an hour. Now news can come to you in an instant from the other side of the world. And news used to travel at 20 miles an hour because that is how fast a horse could run. And the news used to have to travel on the back of a horse with the messenger. And then all of a sudden news could travel faster because they invented the steam engine.
Yeah.
Or the steam engine became, they laid down, they invented it, but they put the lines down.
Yeah.
And now news could travel at 60 miles an hour or 80 miles an hour or 100 miles an hour. And then they invented the telegraph, and then news could travel from one side of a continent to another side of the continent, like North America, in a moment. And now news, because of satellites, can be beamed around the world in an instant, anywhere. So you've still got to fit the news into half hour. And so you choose all those things that are remote from you. And it's not just that the news is depressing. What I find most depressing about the news is most of it leaves me impotent.
Yeah.
There's nothing I can do about it, which I hate because I like progress.
Yeah, obviously. That's like the worst thing for Steve Chalke. So I can't do anything.
So I hear about this suffering and this pain, because you only hear about suffering and pain, and there's nothing whatsoever I can do about any of it, which just brings you to tears, doesn't it? You just sit there like, But who decided all that was, there is suffering and there's pain, but there's joy as well.
Yeah.
And who didn't tell you about the joyous thing that was happening just down the road that you could join in with?
Yeah. So how different the world would be if we were living on a diet of news that was about all the kindness that exists in the world. So you can see why some people just tune out of the news, can't you? Because it's like, well, this isn't adding anything to my life. And I was at the hairdresser's the other day, and my hairdresser, Ramla, she wanted to tell me something because she'd been nominated for an award. She loves to roller skate. She does this fancy roller skating, and there's a tribe of skaters that have got together and created a charity, and they skate around London with backpacks on, and in their backpacks they've got supplies and food and medicines and sanitary towels and everything like that for all the homeless people. They just come across homeless people everywhere in central London. And she was talking about, and she was just saying how good she feels when she's being kind.
Being considerate.
Yeah. It's like transformed her.
And absolutely, there you are. And there's loads of consideration going on, loads of kindness, loads of generosity going on all the time, isn't there? So I was born in Croydon, and I lived at South Norwood is a part of Croydon, and I lived in a little road called Grosvenor Road until I was 10, just off Croydon at South Norwood High Street. And the great news about South Norwood High Street is nothing bad happens there on most days of the year. But no one says,
just the high street.
Latest news, breaking news. Nothing bad has happened on South Norwood High Street today.
Yeah.
But in actual, it's to your point, there are extraordinarily wonderful things happening on most high streets and in most shops, acts of kindness and relationship, etc., all over the place. All of this extraordinarily wonderful stuff that's happening without any crisis. But we only report the crisis and we only report the painful thing, which is painful. But most of humanity is involved in acts of generosity and consideration, etc., etc.
So I think what happens is when what's being reported on all the time is unkindness and cruelty, and which all exists, and I know it all exists, but I think it serves the purpose of stoking fear and
telling a lie, I think,
about who we are.
So a couple of months ago, perhaps it was a bit more than that, I lose count, I read a book that I would like to recommend to you.
Brilliant. Tell me.
It's called Humankind.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Yeah. And it's brilliant, Humankind. And I'll just tell you a couple of stories from it. At the beginning, it tells the story about the Blitz in London. And the theory of war is that and the book goes into massive detail.
Yeah.
It's a very well-researched book, written in a scholarly way, but still a popularist way. And so the theory of war was, and it talks about how this theory of war came about, that you intimidate ordinary people. So you could say, if to win a war, not that I'm very much against any country declaring war, but you hit the power stations, you hit the infrastructure, and you leave the people be because they can't do you any harm. But the theory of war was that you intimidate the ordinary people and they put pressure on their governments and then everything collapses. And so the Third Reich, Hitler, was very familiar with all of this. And that's why they planned the Blitz.
Okay.
So the idea was to blow up the homes of ordinary people and to scare them witless. And that you demoralise the nation, and the English would cave in, and the Germans would invade and take over. So what happened is they didn't hit the power stations. Battersea Power Station in London was there, and the one that they turned into
Tate Modern, right?
Tate Modern, and all of those.
And Battersea Shopping.
Yeah, don't hit all of those. Just hit the houses, and they did, and they did, and they did. But, says this book, Humankind, is what it actually did is it built comradeship.
Yes.
It built community. It built resolve.
Yeah.
It built people who wanted to work together and overcome. And whatever they were bombed with, they'd overcome. And whatever they lost, they'd clear the wreckage away and they'd get on with their lives.
Yeah.
And then grew up the theory that this was something about being British. It was the good old British that stuck
spirit.
together, the Blitz spirit, you know. And then the Brits, we started bombing German towns, Dresden, etc., etc. And we realised it wasn't a British thing at all. It's a human thing.
Yeah.
It's a human thing. And there's one other brilliant story that I'll tell you, or am I boring you?
No.
Okay.
Never, Steve.
So, you know the very famous novel, The Lord of the Flies?
Yeah.
William Golding. And, that's become part of the curriculum in many schools, and films have been made of it, etc., etc. This book, which is all about this group of boys that get shipwrecked, abandoned on an island, and have to set up community together, and how it all starts out well, and they end up killing one another. They end up at war with one another. Yeah. And it's been turned into a film, hasn't it? Probably various times. And it's been so well received by everyone. Everyone talks about The Lord of the Flies because it plays into this theory that humans are bad and the world's full of bad news, and leave it to human beings and
they'll
will
wreck
be bad.
Everything.
They'll wreck everything. It'll be bad news everywhere. Well, the author of Humankind, he wants to say that there's a different way. And so he's told the story, the introduction about the Blitz, etc. And then he deals with The Lord of the Flies. And he says he wondered whether this had actually ever happened. He did an amazing amount of research, which he explains in the book, and he found out it had happened. It had happened to a group of schoolboys from one of the Australian islands, the Pacific islands, and they'd got a rowing boat and they wanted to skip a lesson or something. I really can't remember that. But anyway, this group of boys had rowed out in a rowing boat to get away from something.
Extreme truancy, isn't it?
Yeah, it was truancy gone. And then they got caught in this storm.
Oh, gosh.
And they got pushed along and their boat had got wrecked and they landed on this uninhabited island. where they spent some years, I can't remember how many years, but they spent some years on this island. No one knew they were there. And the story is about how they got on with one another and how they farmed the land and how they created a code of behavior and how when they fell out with one another, what would happen is the two that in the fallout be sent to the opposite ends of the island to think through
about yourself.
and then come back together and eventually they were rescued.
Wow.
And their story's really well told. In fact, you don't even have to read Humankind to read their story. The true story of Lord of the Flies, the story that really happened.
Yeah.
And the story's all about how they bonded together and they made a constructive community and how these boys remain friends for the rest of their lives. Some of them are still alive. And they talk about the deep bond of friendship.
Yeah.
So the point is that humans build community most of the time. There's a lot more good stuff going on in the world than bad stuff.
Absolutely. So we talk, in Oasis, we talk about this habit then of being considerate. And the clue is in the word, right? So consider, be considerate. Consider, to me, when I think about that, like just consider for a moment, think about it for a moment, is very much an act of saying, pause. What do you want to happen here? How is the next action you take going to make this next thing better? So when I think about what we're talking about and we say inviting all of us who are part of the Oasis family to be considerate, is to have that posture towards one another's needs, caring for one another, looking out for one another.
Consider.
Yeah.
Reflect.
Yeah.
Pause.
Yeah.
Take your time. Come to a decision slowly.
Yeah.
As I'm sure we've said before, don't send that first email. Put it in your draft box. Rewrite it.
Yeah.
Don't make that first response. It's a hard thing to learn to do, isn't it?
Yeah.
But as you learn to do it, I work very closely with someone else in Oasis, Joy.
Yeah.
Her name is, there you are, Joy. And I often say to Joy, and she says it to me, we do it for each other actually. I say, Joy, I was going to write and say all these things, but then I just thought, talk to you. And she says, well, you could put it like this and say that. And actually I do the same for her. And we've been doing this for decades together, actually. Yeah. We're helping to regulate one another.
Well, that's exactly it, isn't it? And Jesus invited his followers to consider the lilies of the field. It's like there's a thing in this, I think, about somehow the practice of being considerate is to cause you to slow things down slightly so that your action is the one you really want it to be rather than the one that is reacting.
Absolutely. And to remember that all good things are built through cooperation. They're co-produced. I'm not preaching this to anyone. I've learned slowly that if I want everything done my way, I'll have to work on my own the rest of my life.
It doesn't. Yeah.
In fact, I have a friend who is the same age as me, and he sometimes, so we were kind of students almost together. We never went to the same college or anything, but we knew one another, and we used to sit and talk together. And he sometimes said to me, because we both set out with to do effectively the same thing, and he'll say to me, how come, I don't understand, he says, how Oasis has grown, which it has, is, it's huge.
Big.
Yeah. And the best thing, if I'm honest, I can say, is that it grew by being considerate of what everybody else wanted to do and giving stuff away to people and rejoicing. That's what makes me happy when I see other stuff. And if I'm honest, tried to indicate to my friend several times, the closer you cling to everything,
Yeah.
you don't gain, you lose.
No.
So it's that cooperation and that consideration and that projecting somebody else
Yeah.
and creating a platform for them. None of these things ever eat into you in the end, do they?
No.
But they do promote others, and they promote good news.
Yeah.
Tell a good story about someone else.
Yeah.
Applaud someone else.
Yeah. Developing the practices that we need every day that help us to be considerate. You know, if you go into a classroom, sometimes you'll hear the teacher say, "Eyes on me," to get the attention of the children. Eyes on me. And I feel like that's what we can do for one another as well, isn't it? We can help one another look and see what the kind thing would be. We can, hey, it looks like this. Try this. It might work out a bit different if you try this way.
That's the lesson of life, isn't it?
Yeah.
To slowly learn that thing and to become good news, not bad news in that
exactly.
way. And then to spread that
Yeah.
good news through the way we respond to others, but to always be watching for the person who does it better than us and to learn from them.
Yeah.
So I tell you a royal story.
Always love a royal story.
So I had the extraordinary opportunity of working with King Charles, but he wasn't the king then, he was the prince. So Prince Charles. It was an incredible event. I had been booked to speak at the opening of some sheltered housing for some very elderly people.
Yeah.
They were all in their 80s. And Prince Charles was the patron of this housing association, but he couldn't come. So they'd booked me to speak at the launch instead. A very poor second,
The
third,
Prince
fourth.
Charles standing.
Yeah. I mean, they were scraping the barrel, but they had They had asked me to speak at this thing, and then at the last minute, the royal household rang up and said that Prince Charles could come. And so the boss of this housing association phoned me and said all this. So I said, great, fantastic. So I suppose, I'll do something else. That's okay. And he said, no, we want you to come as well.
Great.
He said, we don't want to drop you. He said, we want you and the prince to share duties.
Oh.
So off I went. Yeah. And this some years ago, and I can't remember actually how we shared the duties. Did he cut the ribbon and I did a talk, or we both did? I remember speaking, so perhaps we both did talks and perhaps he cut the ribbon, or I can't remember. Yeah. And that's not what I remember about it at all, actually. I remember two things about it. One, when a member of the royal family is going to be present at an event, you have to show up hours beforehand because they have to sweep the whole thing, and the security and the dogs come in and all that kind of sniff everything, and they're guards and they're checking you through, and everybody shows their passport or something like that. I can't remember. But anyway, what I remember is that all of these elderly people who lived in these sheltered flats had to gather in this big hall. There were lots of them. I think there was something like 80 flats. Anyway, there was a hall full of elderly people in their 80s sat round big round tables waiting for the prince to come. But they had to be there 2 hours before he showed up. So they're all sitting there, and when you're in your 80s, you're not putting up with this stuff, right? So I go round these tables.
Entertainment.
To these tables. Royal family putting us out like this. Cool. What do I care about the royal family? We should be a republic. We should get rid of that. Cool. Who does he think he is? I haven't had my breakfast yet. I need my cup of tea. I'm not sitting there. I can't, and all this. Everyone was moaning, having to sit there. And I don't blame them,
It's a long time.
Yeah. Anyway, the prince shows up. We do the opening, do our bits and all the rest of it. And then he said to me, would you like to walk around the tables with me? Now, there must have been 10, 12 of these tables with like 10 elderly people on each. All of them I'd already listened to for at least an hour and a half moaning about him. So Charles starts walking round the tables. And he goes to the first one and he asks the first lady there, He shakes her hand and he looks at her and holds her hand and he asks a question. And she gives this long, rambling answer to this question. And then he asks her another question.
Yeah.
And the point was, his question was brilliant and proved that he'd been listening to the answer to the first question.
Yeah.
You know how some people, they ask you another question totally unrelated to what you said? You know,
they weren't listening.
He asked her a question that he could have only asked if he was listening to every syllable. And then he proceeded to go round each table in the whole place, sometimes talking to, 2 of them or 3 of them together, but on every occasion asking at least one other question, sometimes more, that were all impossible to ask unless he'd been really listening and watching their eyes and their emotions and their reactions. It was impossible to pre-plan any of this, and it was all about proper consideration.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was a master. In fact, I said to him afterwards, I said, where'd you? And he said, oh, it's the upbringing. And I said, it's not just that. No. I do remember, I said, I had never had the opportunity of being part of a masterclass in consideration. It was incredible. And I remember it to this day. It was just beautiful to watch. Anyway, in the end, he gets back in his car with all his security and off he goes. I tell you, each one of them was from that moment on a royalist. Yeah. They were all converted because of his consideration.
Yeah. You win people with kindness.
You win people with kindness. You win people with the second question that proves that you're listening. You win by considering them.
Yeah. It's a bit like love, isn't it?
It's a lot like love.